There's so much happening in this country right now that boggles the imagination, and you're at the very center of it. And so I wanted to get started right away. You're on the House Intelligence Committee, and you're investigating the possible Russian interference, and I say possible, I think we all think it's probable, interference with our election this last presidential election. And the big question I have is people seem to know about this. This was something that you talked about well before the election. Why weren't people talking about this more before November?
This is a great question because you're absolutely right. You might remember in late July, President Trump, then candidate Trump, in a press conference said, hey, Russians, if you're listening, hack Hillary Clinton's emails, you'll be richly rewarded. He wasn't saying that out of the blue. It was already recognized at that point that the Russians had been involved in the hacking of information, the dumping of documents. And I think, we had a terrible confluence of events where we had a presidential candidate, rather than condemning foreign interference, who welcomed it. I'm confident it been Mitt Romney, the nominee at the time, or John McCain, they would have had the strength of character to say, hey, Russians, back off. I don't want your help. I don't need your help. I despise your intervention. But sadly, we had a candidate who welcomed it. And I think where Democrats fell down on the job is we failed to persuade the country why they should care. Why they should care more about the fact that the Russians were the ones who wanted the American people to see these materials. They cared more about what was in the documents than they did that a foreign power was interfering in our affairs.
It seems strange to me, but yeah, as you said, when I was growing up, and I know that we're similar ages, when I was growing up, we were always taught in school, like, it's treason, that there was nothing more sacred, or there was no worse crime in the world than treason. And it seemed like it was taken almost kind of lightly, that, Russia may be interfering, but that might be a good thing, or it was adding to the fun of the combat. It seemed people weren't taking it as seriously as they should have been taking it.
Well, I think that's right. And
there's also been a question that, did President Obama, he knew about it, but he was reticent maybe to push it too much because it might look like he was putting his finger on the scale? Is that possible?
That's exactly right. At the time, Senator Feinstein and I were urging the administration first to make public attribution, to tell the American people what was going on, that the Russians were doing this, and they were reluctant. I think they didn't want to be seen as interfering or putting their hand on the scale. They were also worried about the Russian reaction. Maybe the Russians would retaliate. My feeling, though, was that the failure to speak out, the failure to condemn, to attribute the Russian involvement, would only invite further Russian involvement. And I do think, though, when you asked about how did this happen, why was it effective, the president, when he did later speak, unfortunately after the election, about this, really put his finger on it when he said that what made the Russian intervention so powerful, so destructive, was the fact that our politics was deeply divided enough where one party took the view, at least a substantial number in that party, that it's okay if a foreign power intervenes as long as it helps us and hurts the other side. And unless we can do something about those divisions within our country, unless we can forge a consensus that in the next election, because our intelligence community has concluded the Russians will do this again, that whether it helps or hurts, we will all condemn that kind of interfering.
Obviously, there's a lot that's top secret that we're not allowed to know about, but do you have any concept of when we're going to start hearing about results of findings, or whether or not there might be potentially arrests? Is that something that might happen in the next year? Could it be a lot longer than that?
This is, I think, really probably the most difficult question for all of us on the committee, which is, how long will this take? We all, I think, feel a real sense of urgency. We know the country is watching. We want to get this done. At the same time, if we're not thorough about it, then it won't add much value. And so we need to move as expeditiously as possible, but I really can't tell you how long that's going to take. It's an investigation that's global in reach, and probably one of the least sexy issues that we're confronting is we simply don't have the resources, the staffing, the size, and the scope to be able to do an investigation quickly of this magnitude. It's one of the reasons why, in addition to what we do, I've been championing an independent commission, because I think having that single focus, well-resourced body would really add to what we're doing.
It boggles my mind that we wouldn't have adequate funding to find out whether or not a foreign power interfered with our election.
Well,
That it feels like we are the richest nation in the world. Shouldn't we be able to raise that money and find out once and for all, was our democracy meddled with?
Well, you're absolutely right. And the reason why this, I think, is so important, this is not an effort to relitigate the election. I know the president likes to simply say, oh, they're just sore losers.
Right.
We know the Russians will do this again. Indeed, we know the Russians are doing this in Europe right now. And I can tell you, the Russians are very good at their cyber operations. If they want to get into your computers, Conan, and I think they do, they will get into your computers. And it doesn't matter how good your cyber defense is. The only way we protect ourselves is if we can inoculate ourselves, if we can inform our public that this is what they do, this is how they do it, and to reject it. That's really the only defense.
What's interesting is I heard a great analysis not long ago that said that the Russians have been trying to interfere with our election in clumsy ways since the 1980s. They've been very interested in somehow influencing our election, but pre-internet, there wasn't a lot they could do except make really phony-looking supermarket handouts, that we might believe. But now that there's an internet, what they needed were two things: an internet and a deeply divided country, and then they're able to go to work. And so it feels like, yes, it's going to happen a lot more.
Oh, this is exactly right. And in fact, in the 1980s, I prosecuted an FBI agent who was spying for the Soviets. He was seduced by an attractive KGB asset named Svetlana. They're always named Svetlana for some reason.
Trust me, in my case, it was Svetlana. Yeah. She got my computer. They know everything now.
Well, but that was back in the old days, very rudimentary. But it taught me a lot about Russian tradecraft and what the Russians were after, how they target people, how they recruit people, the different techniques they use to extort people, to compromise people. Obviously, we're trying to determine whether any of the techniques the Russians, then the Soviets, used then, or the Russians have used now in Europe and other places, they also used here.